Welcome back to the channel. Thank you very much for joining me. Hope everybody had a happy New Year's. Enjoy time with family and friends. Watched a bunch of college football. There was a lot of bowl games. We're going to get into that. And how many of you have New Year's resolutions? It happens every year at this time. I have a few New Year's resolutions I want to keep this year. I want to exercise more, eat more healthy. But one thing I'm not going to change is drinking good craft beer. And I've got a beer for you a little bit later from Crooked Stave Brewing out of Colorado. It's a petite sour blueberry sour ale. I'm going to get into that a little bit later. We got so much to talk to you about the bowl games that are on the 30th. January 1st, we're going to talk USC football. I've got an update for those that are in the LBC college football pick 'em pool. I've got the standings going into the championship game. All of this and a lot more on this episode of Trojans Talk on Tap. I am your host, Rick Aniath. Thanks so much for joining me. Appreciate you subscribing to the channel. I'd also like to thank the sponsors that have jumped on board and are sponsors of the channel. That's Matter of Craft, Scratch Kitchen and Tap Room in Huntington Beach, as well as Bradley's Fine Wine and Spirits in Tustin, California. Check them out. Always a great place to pick up your fine craft beer, wine, and spirits, or have a great meal, full bar at Matter of Craft in Huntington Beach. Let's talk about some things that happened with the new year. Lots of changes going on in college football. As you know, the transfer portal, NIL changing, conference realignment. You got to make changes. You got to be changing or you're going to get left behind. And we're going to get into that talking about these bowl games. And the transfer portal just closed on January 2nd. Today is Wednesday, January 3rd. For those teams that played on New Year's Day, players have 5 days after New Year's Day, so approximately the 6th, to get their paperwork in. And then it takes a couple days to publicly make known which player is jumping into the transfer portal. So names will be trickling through. If you wonder why some names are still coming through, that's what's going to happen. So let's talk about some of the changes that are happening with first with USC. What are some things that have to change with USC to make it successful moving forward? And as you know, speaking of another change with college football, we're going from the 4-team playoff next year into the 12-team playoff. And obviously, there's 4 teams from the Pac-12 that will be going into the Big Ten, 4 teams from the Pac-12 going into the Big 12, and then 2 teams, Stanford and Cal, going into the ACC, along with Texas and Oklahoma going to the SEC. So lots of changes. So let's get into talking about USC and really quick recapping the Holiday Bowl. Miller Moss is going to be the change, not only in his style of play, very smart quarterbacks, been in the program for 2 years, has picked up the system. That was obvious to anybody who watched the Holiday Bowl. Do I expect Miller Moss to be performing that every game? No. Is he going to be the front runner to compete for the quarterbacking job at USC? Yes. Does Lincoln Riley need to bring in another transfer portal quarterback? Yes. There's only 2 quarterbacks on the roster. You need to have another one. And USC is making changes. As you heard earlier today, Dorian Singer jumped into the transfer portal as another wide receiver. USC did get a commitment from Anderson, I believe, is a wide receiver from Tufts, and they've extended an offer to Oregon State wide receiver Silas Bolden. So USC is continuing to make additions, and players are still going to the transfer portal. Offensive lineman Andrews DeWerk, I believe his name is, Andrew DeWerk, went into the transfer portal as well. So USC continuing to make changes. One thing that's not going to change is Lincoln Riley's offense. Something that needs to change, obviously, is the defense. And USC has addressed that in the month of December, hiring 3 new defensive coaches, D'Anton Lynn, Matt Entz, and Doug Belk. And I imagine, will continue to work the transfer portal. They have brought over some defensive players, signed some key defensive players in the high school recruiting class, and will continue to mine that moving forward to improve the defense. Those are the changes going on with USC. Let's talk about some changes that we saw in the last couple of bowl games, Saturday, December 30th, and January 1st. Speaking of changes, let's talk about the Peach Bowl. Sometimes coaches and teams change, and sometimes they don't. And Ole Miss really, and Lincoln Riley and Jackson Dart tore apart Penn State. They dominated that game. It was great to see Lane Kiffin pulling out all of his bags of tricks. He had key plays that were called at the right time. Jackson Dart was just humming along with that offense. And there was comments after the game where James Franklin, Penn State's coach, mentioned that, Ole Miss was going after those players that were opting out, the weaknesses on their team, maybe players that didn't have a lot of reps, and they were going after those players. And Lane Kiffin basically responded by, hey, we get paid a lot of money to be head coaches, and, that's your job. Your job is to come up with a game plan and attack until they can't stop it. So congrats to Ole Miss taking out Penn State. Sometimes things change, and sometimes they stay the same. James Franklin is 3-2 in year 6 bowls. The 2 games he's lost to, ex-USC head coaches, and Lane Kiffin, and back in the 2017 Rose Bowl to good old Clay Helton. So Penn State, looking forward to playing them next year at the Coliseum. I don't know how James Franklin can keep a job, or any head coach for that matter, that has been coaching for 10 years and is 4-16 against the 2 best teams in their conference. Name me another coach who is still surviving. So perhaps Penn State's administration has to reevaluate, but as long as they keep James Franklin, I think Trojan fans are pretty happy. And so is Ole Miss. Congratulations to Ole Miss for getting a facelift and a tummy tuck. First time in 120 years of playing football down at Ole Miss that they won 11 games, and take it for an ex-USC head coach and a transfer from USC at quarterback to make that happen. Congrats, Lane Kiffin, man. Fight on, brother. And hotty toddy. Moving on, the Music City Bowl. Again, a lot of these games, opt-outs, players are injured, players in the transfer portal. Yes, bowl season's not the same, but it did give you some indication of what's going to happen for next year, or what changes have to be made. In this one, you had Auburn, who was kind of up and down all year. They almost knocked off Alabama if it wasn't for that 4th and 31 gravedigger play down at Jordan-Hare. And they had Peyton Thorne. That was the quarterback from Mississippi State. And Hugh Freeze has done a good job of turning around Auburn and getting them ready he's attacking the transfer portal this year, getting them ready for next year. But I was a little surprised to see the score. Maryland 31, Auburn 13. Really? And Maryland didn't play Talia Tagovailoa because he's preparing for the NFL draft. And they had a combination of Billy Edwards Jr. and Cameron Edge at quarterback. And to beat Auburn in that fashion, a little surprising. So Maryland has really turned itself around with Mike Loxley. Good luck to them. SC will be playing at Maryland next year in the Big Ten. Moving on to the Citrus Bowl. Tennessee 35, Iowa 0. That is not a typo. And again, talk about some change. Tennessee put in their freshman quarterback in Nico Iamaleava, and he lit up Iowa. And Iowa was supposed to be known for its defense and not known for its offense, and they pretty much stuck to that. This was the second time back-to-back that Iowa's been shut out. If you remember, they lost the Big Ten championship game to Michigan, 49-0, and now they back it up by going 35-0. Kirk Ferentz kind of was, pregame or before the bowl was kind of blasting Lincoln Riley about some school out there, about stats and games. Haven't played defense since Ronnie Lott. Well, let me tell you something. Iowa, you haven't played any offense since Brad Banks. And that was the 2003 Orange Bowl. You might remember that game, Kirk Ferentz. USC blasted Iowa 38-17. Yeah, Iowa did make it close with that last-minute touchdown. Congrats. But that's the last time that Iowa's had a quarterback. I could be wrong. If there's anybody in the chat, anybody who's watching this, drop me a message. Let me know if there was a better quarterback since 2003, Brad Banks, who's the runner-up to Carson Palmer for the Heisman Trophy. But Iowa, wow. They played 3 ranked teams this year, and they lost by a combined score of 92-0. Hey, I'm okay with Iowa sticking to what Kirk Ferentz thinks is offense out there in the Big Ten. That's fantastic. I know USC doesn't play Iowa next year, but we probably will in 2025. Can't wait to see you, Iowa. Moving on, the Reliaquest Bowl. This was an interesting game. LSU 35, Wisconsin 31. LSU comes back and takes the first lead in the game in the last 3 minutes. Congrats to Nussmeier, his first career start, kind of like a Miller Moss. And he led them back to beat Wisconsin 35-31. Wisconsin is not your same Wisconsin. Credit Luke Fickell and offensive coordinator Phil Longo for changing Wisconsin, changing the culture, and going from a running primarily offense to a passing offense, spreading it out, getting it down the field, pushing the ball down the field. And they did that with Tanner Mordecai, the transfer from SMU. This was his last game. He played in the game, did an outstanding job, had over 300 yards passing and 3 touchdowns. Basically, Wisconsin had had over 506 yards of total offense, of which 75% of it approximately was passing yards. You never hear that before. And here's a good example that things were going to change there. You might recall Trojans in the Holiday Bowl. Isaac Garendo was a transfer running back, physical, hard runner from Wisconsin. He saw the writing on the wall and was looking for an opportunity his senior year to rack up more carries and yards. And he knew most likely that Wisconsin was not going to be it because of the change in philosophy. So speaking of changes, just came out today that Brian Kelly, he's a little bit stubborn sometimes, fired Matt House as defensive coordinator and 3 other defensive coaches. I guess, LSU being ranked at the bottom of the SEC next to actually 13th in the SEC defense, giving up over 400 yards total defense a game. It was just too much. LSU's got to make changes just like USC when it comes to defense, and they're going to be breaking a new quarterback. Could be Nussmeier, could be somebody else from the transfer portal. But that game, the first game of the year, LSU SC at Allegiant Stadium in Vegas, that's going to be full of surprises and full of change. Let's take a second here. I want to update you on the LBC college football playoff standings. As you know, we've got a college football pool going. And going into the championship game, here are the pool standings. First place with 26 points, Tyler A. Tie for second between 3 guys at 25 points, Rich M., Gixxer Squid, Mike A., and tied for 5th with 23, John J. and Jason L. And just a reminder for everybody in the pool and for those that are watching, again, thanks to our sponsors, the first place is a $100 gift card at Matter of Craft in Huntington Beach. Second place is sponsored by Bradley's Fine Wine and Spirits. And we have, what do we got here? Let me show you. For second place, we've got a 12-pack, a craft beer 12-pack of these fine beers. These beers here, including Pliny the Elder. Thank you very much for Bradley's Fine Wine and Spirits. That's your second place prize. A lot of tasty brews there. And then third place, a $75 gift card to your choice. Could be an Amazon card, could be a Visa card, your choice. And then fourth and fifth place, we've got for you some fun. Let's see what we got. For fourth and fifth, an LBC trucker hat. So there you go. Congratulations to those that are still in the running. You're going to need to get me a combined score for the national championship game, and that will be used as a tiebreaker. Moving on, let's talk about, let's see. Let's go into, we're going to talk about the Sugar Bowl first, and then we'll get into the Rose Bowl. Again, sometimes things change. Sometimes they stay the same. And with this was interesting because last year, both teams met in the Alamo Bowl, and Washington won that game 27-20. And if you recall, the same coaches, it was Sark versus Kalen DeBoer, the same quarterbacks. It was Michael Penix Jr. versus Quinn Ewers. The difference in this game is Sark keeps on recruiting. That is a constant. And now being at Texas with their NIL and their ability to attract top 4 and 5 stars, he built up that defense. That defense was reportedly bigger and faster than it was last year. And he built up the trenches, the offensive and the defensive lines. In fact, Urban Meyer was quoted as saying on a show, trying to remember, it was The Herd. It was with Colin Cowherd. He was saying that he got a chance to check out the practice, and he saw how big and fast Texas was, and he predicted that Texas was going to beat Washington. That didn't happen. But constant, Sark knows how to recruit. His issue's always been about play calling. And Trojans, you might know what I mean. 18 years ago, tomorrow it'll be the 18th anniversary tomorrow of that national championship game in the Rose Bowl against Texas. Some say that it was Sark who made that call, 4th and 1, by not having Reggie Bush on the field. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you know, was it Reggie Bush, Lane Kiffin, or Pete Carroll that did not have Reggie Bush on the field. I don't know the official answer to it, but I've heard from a lot of people that it was Sark. And this game came down to 4 plays at the 12-yard line. And this is what Sark does. Sark is an offensive guru. And by the way, you're going against a Washington team that was 93rd in the country in total defense, yards allowed, allowing over 400 yards a game. And you get 4 shots and you don't convert. There's a 5-star quarterback. You got Quinn Ewers and you got a genius play caller in Steve Sarkisian. You don't get it done. Changes have to be made when it comes to winning big games. The next big game that Sarkisian wins will be his first. Let's move on to the most incredible, exciting game, and that is the Rose Bowl. Michigan winning in overtime, 27-20 over Alabama. And boy, this game had everything. And it was one of those games, kind of like the 2006 Rose Bowl between Texas and USC, that people will remember. And a lot of changes came afterwards. As you know, USC was going for a 3rd national title, had a 34-game winning streak, and ESPN built up USC that whole week before the championship, and Texas was pissed off and disrespected. And hey, what can you say? USC lost. The rest of the country was happy because they're moving on. And maybe some people had the same feeling here with Nick Saban and Alabama losing. But let's not forget, this was an overtime game. And when it comes to this game, you give Nick Saban a month to prepare, and you can't doubt Nick Saban with a month to prepare. And yes, Alabama did get in. People are going to question why they got in. Hey, they got in and they deserved it. Okay. It's Nick Saban. They're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. And let's face it, look at the TV numbers that came out. 27 million people, over 27 million people watched this game. So whether you choose to like it or not, it's somewhat of an invitational because ESPN made some big money. And you'll have the NCAA, you'll have the College Football Playoff Committee, and you'll have ESPN. And each one will point the finger that, no, we were just following him. No, we were following them. Nobody's going to take accountability. But anyhow, when it comes to Nick Saban, I never doubt Nick Saban. In fact, I backed it up in the LBC college football pick 'em pool. I had Alabama, and I had Washington, with Washington winning it all. So I'm not hiding from it. That's who I took. And, you don't doubt the GOAT. Nick Saban is Nick Saban for a reason. But let me tell you, I think it came to bite him. Maybe Nick Saban has lost a little bit on his fastball, because there was a play at the very end of the game and everything was exposed. How does a guy like Nick Saban not have a 4 or 5-star quarterback set up to follow Bryce Young? He didn't. And he, coaching changes happen all the time. And he had to get another offensive coordinator. And I'll call it, he settled on Tommy Rees, 31-year-old offensive coordinator from Notre Dame. He tried getting Ryan Grubb from Washington, but Ryan Grubb said no. And along with Tommy Rees came Tyler Buchner. Tyler Buchner was Notre Dame's quarterback, but he was injured. And they had Jalen Milroe. So perhaps they were sold on Jalen Milroe. Perhaps they thought Tyler Buchner was going to be the answer. Who knows? But we saw what happened earlier in the year, losing at home to Texas. We saw the debacle in South Florida, barely winning 17-3. It was a pillow fight, and all three quarterbacks couldn't quarterback. But then something happened. Okay, Jalen Milroe's a fine athlete. He's a great athlete, not really a quarterback. He's got two clubs in his quarterback bag, in my opinion, and that's the run and either the screen or the check down. That's all he's got. And Michigan knew that. They knew that, and it came to roost in that final play of the game. And part of it was because of the low snap. And I've got to credit number 55, Mason Graham, out of Servite High School. That kid was working the center all night long. And on that last play, he stoned that center. In fact, so much so that this young man jumped into the portal today, and that's Seth McLaughlin. Mason Graham, number 55, owns Seth McLaughlin, and perhaps that was the reason why he was getting low snaps, because he knew he had to react. Now, Mason Graham, this kid's a stud. He wrestled at Servite High School, and he is Kirk Herbstreit mentioned it twice during the broadcast that he was good at angles and leverage. Yes, if you ever wrestled before, you know that. And Mason Graham, wrestling for Alan Clinton at Servite. He's a longtime top Southern California coach. He's coached for over 35 years at El Medina and Servite. He started the program at Servite. He's also the athletic director, and he had a pact with Troy Taylor that football players would have to come out for wrestling. And that's how he's going to help build the wrestling program at Servite. And Mason Graham is a product of that. And you could see that on display. And let me tell you, Michigan is doing a great job with their NIL, and that's where USC has to change. If they want to compete in this changing market, USC has to get its NIL right. And for whatever reason, if Jim Harbaugh jumps after this game and goes to the NFL, or for some reason the NCAA, which I doubt, removes or suspends Jim Harbaugh and players jump in the portal, USC, if Mason Graham jumps in the portal, you got to get him. And there's a chance because he's just finished his sophomore year. He was recruited by Sean Nua. And Sean Nua is the defensive line coach at SC. And back a couple of years ago, you might remember, he got Aiden Hutchinson and David Ajabo drafted in the NFL. Aiden Hutchinson going number 2 overall to the Detroit Lions. So wouldn't that be something, Trojans? Mason Graham coming to USC. Number 55, a defensive lineman, to come play against the Big Ten, finish out his junior year, get coached up by Newell, and get prepped for the NFL, to be a top 5 pick. If he comes, yes, I understand number 55 is the linebacker number at USC, but if he comes, you give it to him. You give it to him. That's where USC has to change. You have to change and adapt. You've got to take a look at your NIL program. And with Jen Cohen, I believe in her, and she's doing great things at USC, and she'll get this right with NIL because it is changing. And congrats to Michigan because they're figuring it out. They have a retention program for players that they want to keep one more year. I think it's even called One More Year NIL Collective, and that is how one of the things that they did to beat Michigan is they had a bunch of great players that stayed for another year, and they worked the transfer portal as well. So much so that, things are changing when Nick Saban was quoted after the game as saying, "We just didn't finish the last 4 minutes of the game like we'd like to. And we're all very disappointed," Saban said. But one thing I told them in the locker room, this is one of the most amazing seasons in Alabama football history in terms of where this team came from and why they were able to accomplish. Milroe passed for 116 yards and rushed for 63 for the Tide, whose 11-game winning streak ended. That seems a little bit odd for Nick Saban. Like, he wasn't upset. He seemed like, oh, I'm patting these guys on the back. And 116 yards passing from your quarterback. Wasn't this the team that was more dynamic at the end of the year than Fresno? I mean, I'm sorry, than Florida State? And Florida State with their third string quarterback, everybody's giving a hard time because they only passed for 55 yards. My God, in the championship game, a Nick Saban Alabama team quarterback had 116-yard passing. Again, something coming off of Nick Saban's fastball and then his comments afterwards. Give him milk and cookies too. What's going on? Perhaps what's going on is college football is changing so fast that maybe Nick Saban is thinking about retiring. Just an opinion. Because here's another thing you got to add up. And here's what Nick Saban had to say. This was on the 29th of December, 5 days ago. College football is heading towards a semi-pro direction with NIL and the expanded playoff. Quote Nick Saban, we're moving in the sort of semi-pro direction in terms of there's pay for play now. We call it name, image, and likeness, but that's pay for play basically. And I'm all for the players sharing in what's happening. You've got guys transferring from one team to the next and will with very little guidelines as to how to control any of these things. And we're going to have a playoff very similar to the NFL. And I'm not saying any of those things are bad. I'm just saying they're all completely changes from what we had 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. Exactly, Nick Saban, whatever. Cry for me over spoiled milk, okay? Just because everybody else gets to participate in name, image, and likeness, and it's just not money and bags being exchanged in the SEC where see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, okay? So that was a message, because Nick Saban doesn't speak like that unless there's a message. He's speaking that to Greg Sankey, who's speaking that to Tommy Tuberville, who is trying to get legislation passed through Congress for guardrails with NIL and the transfer portal. And when a Republican senator ever goes to the government and asks them to regulate their business, something doesn't add up right. But that's what happened. What's happening is the SEC is changing. They're seeing change. They need things to change because now they're not able to keep their rosters the way they have to. They got to work even harder. And if it's any indication, take a look at this year. You've got a Pac-12 and a Big Ten team in the championship. And for the first time in a long time, you don't have an SEC team in the national championship game. In fact, you had Texas, who's going to the SEC, who lost, and you had Alabama, who lost. And you have Washington, that nobody's giving respect to, leaving the Pac-12, going into the Big Ten, as well as Michigan Big Ten. So this is a division between Fox and ESPN. Changes are going to be happening, and it's going to be exciting to see. Let me know what changes that you are interested in seeing. Am I wrong about Alabama? Do you see Nick Saban possibly retiring? Will Sarkisian ever win a big game? Is he prepped and ready to go to the SEC? Let it be known that changes happen so fast right now in college football. 2.5 years ago, in July of 2021, when Oklahoma and Texas announced that they were leaving for the SEC, who would have thunk 6 months later, if I would have told you at the end of the 2021 season, that you know what? Arizona is going to beat Oklahoma in the 23 bowl game, and Washington would beat Michigan. Washington would beat Texas in the Sugar Bowl in 2023. Everybody would have laughed because in 2021, Arizona under Jedd Fisch in his first year was 1-11, and Washington was 4-8 during a season where Jimmy Lake got fired. But those two teams have turned things around so quickly because of the new rules with transfer portal, NIL, and what's happening now with conference realignment, also influencing those decisions. So with all those changes happening, there's going to be more. Stay tuned with the channel. Appreciate you, and fight on.